name is Jack Delbach. I'm curator of birds and animals here at California Academy of Sciences. I think I'm with you. Met me. And it's my pleasure today to introduce Christine Wilkinson. Christine got her bachelor's degree at Cornell University in natural resources and applied ecology. And while she was an undergraduate, she had a chance to go to Africa. And so she fell in love with Africa very quickly on the first trip. And then she was able to go back after she finished her bachelor's degree. And she became the field manager for the Kasokwa Forest Project in Uganda. And there she was studying some really amazing, very charismatic megafauna. And I think that probably had a big impact on her career trajectory too. After that, when she got back, she actually came here to CAS, and that's where we first met her and interacted with her. And she actually was the digital learning programs coordinator. Speaking of wildlife conflict. And she ran an amazing program where they developed educational materials for after school for kids in middle and high school. And she did that for several years and got a lot of amazing experience and led that program. And then she decided she wanted to go back and do a PhD. So she went to UC Berkeley and she got her PhD in environmental science, policy, and management. She returned to Africa where she again worked on charismatic megafauna, mostly carnivores. And she did a lot of great work studying carnivore movement and especially conflict and trying to study how humans and wildlife can coexist on a complicated landscape. In addition, and since then, she's published over 20 papers. She's got 7 more papers in the pipeline, so she's amazingly productive in her work. And most of her work is studying the behavior of carnivores. So she's doing more in the Bay Area. She, all the while in her career, she's been a very outspoken advocate for diversity in science, and she's been working tirelessly to improve that. And now she's again back in the Bay Area, where she's a research associate here at the Academy in ornithology and ornithology, but also working with her partners at UC Berkeley on a very prestigious Schmidt Science Fellowship. So that's where her funding is coming from. So we're really excited that with that funding, she can go wherever she wanted, but she's choosing to work here in the College of Berkeley. We're really excited to have her. And Christine, I can't wait to hear more about your research. So take it away.
This is on, right?
Yes, thank you.
Well, that was very sweet. I've known Jack, obviously, as he just said, in various capacities when I was an educator. So it's kind of a fun little shift to be here as a researcher now. It's always been the master plan though, so it's great to be back. I also love that you kept referring to the animals that many people think of as uncharismatic, like hyenas and coyotes. I think they're charismatic. As charismatic megafauna, so thank you. That was fantastic. So yeah, today I'm going to talk with y'all a little bit about my research and how I use my own queer intersectional identities and viewpoints and lenses to be able to approach my research in a more holistic way, a more empathetic way, and be able to relate to both the wildlife that are dealing with conflict and also the people that are dealing with conflict. And I'll introduce you to 2 of my main study species. We'll get to those in a minute. Give you a couple of case studies in Kenya and California, and then end on a point of hope about how we can kind of move forward, bringing our whole selves into science and conservation. So I like to keep these things lively and interactive. I know people probably get hungry before lunch. So we're going to start out with a question that everyone can answer. You can use this QR code or this code on slido.com for like phones, laptop, whatever you got. And I want us to think about the wildlife that we are connected to here in the Bay Area. What is your favorite local wildlife species that you've seen this year? Folks online, you can participate as well. And let me know if you're having issues. Oh no, it looks like people are working. Yay. Raccoon! Yeah, the raccoon's the only Parker. Ooh, something else. Love that. Red-tailed hawk. It's kind of fun asking this question to people that work in a museum, a science museum. Because we'll get like some more specific answers. Like I asked this to some youth the other day and they were like, bird. Great. That works. Red-tailed hawks are very, very popular. Awesome. I love that we've got some misunderstood animals popping up here. Give just another like 30 seconds. Owlfly. How do you know that? Great word owl. Awesome. Green hair streaks. Nice. Slugs. I love that. Edgy answers here, people. This is good. Pretty much like trying to pretend I was the David Attenborough of Queens. I love rats so much that like one year, I think I was like 6, they renovated the subways and like the rats disappeared and I was devastated. Of course, they're still there. They came back and I was super happy. And I also would like go and the dinner table at night with like cicadas and their exoskeletons like plastered on my shirt, which my mom hated. Hornets, you know, cockroaches, all that stuff. I would go around and pretend I had my own TV show. Although like really didn't know how to have my own TV show because everyone that I watched on TV, like Steve Irwin and Jeff Corwin, all cis white dudes, right? So I just knew I wanted to work with animals. And basically like I was hooked on wildlife. I didn't know how to do anything with them. That's also me as an animal. So it was only later in life that I realized I actually wanted to be a non-human animal when I was a kid. That was what I wanted to be growing up. I remember saying that I wanted to grow up to be a lion at one point. And I remember several months in 3rd grade, my poor teachers, I was pretending that I was a dog with the very creative name of DOG. And they would actually let me like sit under the table sometimes. Total free. So anyway, while I surprisingly didn't grow up to be part of the furry community, no shade to the furry community, I have really started to think about how we as sort of holistic people, right, me as a queer, Black, intersectional being, have so much in common with some of the misunderstood animals that we live alongside in urban and non-urban spaces. And I actually ended up studying a lot of those misunderstood animals. And I started to realize there's a lot that can be gained from bringing our whole selves into the science to understand how we can better solve some of our conservation challenges in new ways. So as a queer Black woman, it's probably no accident that I've ended up working with a lot of species that are misunderstood and who have experiences that reflect my own. But I didn't always recognize the importance of that human element in wildlife conservation. I had a really wildlife-centered beginning. My early scientific years in undergrad were focused almost entirely on wildlife. I dove into natural history. I wanted to identify everything in sight. This was on the East Coast. I studied the feeding ecology of squirrels and the reproductive success of herring gulls. I looked at baboons and reproductive success for them with an STI and disease and that kind of thing. But underneath it all, I also knew that I was using wildlife as an escape. I was a really shy person, believe it or not. And wildlife are really easy to love. And above all else, I just wanted to learn about them and conserve them. I'm just going to move this a little bit. It's kind of annoying. Okay. But as we all know, wildlife conservation needs people. So Doc mentioned that I studied abroad in Kenya and Tanzania when I was in undergrad. And I went there initially because I wanted to get involved in this wildlife management course, but also because I wanted to connect with my roots as a Black person. The DNA test says all of Africa, thanks slavery. And I was just like, okay, this is a way to do both of those things. And I really was only interested in the wildlife. But 2 weeks into being in Kenya, I had met a bunch of people, some of which are my friends still to this day. And one of them said to me, if a lion kills a person, you may never see any compensation or acknowledgement by the government, but if a person kills a lion, the government's going to be here in 2 days to arrest that person. People just did not feel seen by their government in relation to things like human-wildlife conflict and other conservation challenges. And that was a theme that I heard over and over again that really completely catalyzed a shift in my view to wanting to work with people and step outside of my comfort zone and figure out how we can put the power of conservation into the hands of the people who are living alongside animals that are causing these challenges or involved in these challenges, and how we can
really elevate wildlife conservation as a ground up endeavor. So that's what shifted me. And since then, it's just been an amazing learning journey. And conservation challenges, of course, are usually tied to people's needs, often boiling down to people's livelihoods and health being threatened, like feeling the need to hunt birds with slingshots or snare larger wildlife for food, or feeling the need to poison, kill, or otherwise remove wildlife to protect your livestock or your family. All of these needs and the perceptions around them, regardless of how they track with the ecology and the science, are valid and drive whether wildlife conservation will work or not in any given context. And a lot of human-wildlife interactions involve carnivores, which of course is what I work largely on, although not exclusively. So we know that carnivores and people live alongside one another in even the most pristine landscapes, and that we influence one another's well-being. So I included this picture in the lower right corner. I took it in the Masai Mara National Park. Have y'all ever heard of the Serengeti? Has anyone been to the Serengeti? Okay. So Masai Mara, you might have been there too. It's the northern part of that ecosystem. We think of that ecosystem as this pristine, beautiful place, the Great Migration. These are tourist vehicles surrounding this leopard. And what you can't see is that there's a gazelle nearby that the leopard is able to hunt more easily by using these tourist vehicles, and he knows it. And so this is just an example, even in these pristine places, of how we influence one another, and humans and carnivores are inextricably linked across the landscape. And two of the carnivores that my research focuses on that I think can really illustrate human-carnivore interactions are coyotes and hyenas, which are going to be the stars of the case studies that I focus on today. And I actually think we have a lot in common with coyotes and hyenas, and that they also have a lot in common with each other. So what do they have in common? How many of y'all have seen this movie? Okay, keep your hand raised if you think that hyenas were done dirty by Disney. Okay, pretty much everyone did. Good, I don't have to change anyone's minds. So, hyenas were vilified, depicted as stupid, etc., mean, kind of dirty and vile. And in real life, they're also persecuted across their range because those attitudes are everywhere, and Disney certainly did not help. And the other thing about hyenas is that they have this strange genitalia that creates a lot of fear around them and perpetuates this idea of them being associated with witchcraft and other sorts of evil, vile, scary things. It doesn't help their reputation. When in fact, they're actually very intelligent creatures. They are very social. They're very family-oriented. And I'll tell you more about some cool adaptations they have in a second. But they are highly persecuted and vilified. Similarly, coyotes are also vilified. So on the left is a picture of wolf pelts. White folks in this country really tried and succeeded in killing off the wolf in most of the country back in the day. And coyotes were able to move into those new habitats without the threat of the wolf. Of course, we then started to kill them too. So these are coyote carcasses or pelts. And to this day, in a lot of states, coyotes are still classified as vermin. We tried to do an assessment of the populations of coyotes in this country. It's pretty much impossible. So for about 25 of the states, you have these population estimates that are like either from 150,000 to 700,000, somewhere in there. And then for the rest of them, you can take out a permit, or you don't even need a permit to be able to kill these animals. And nobody keeps track of the ones that are being killed, let alone the ones that are alive. In fact, there was I think actually you have some pictures up here in the museum of some wildlife killing contests with coyotes being killed. And also someone just won, I think, Wildlife Photographer of the Year, one of those awards at the Natural History Museum in London. There's a big exhibit of the USA's wildlife killing contests, including coyotes, bobcats, and others. And the other thing about them, I think, just looping back to how I identify with these animals, is that this experience that coyotes have and the way that they're being viewed and around the country even today, and especially in the past, really reflects the experiences of my Black slave ancestors and Black folks today. And I wrote an essay about that earlier this year. So there's a lot that I think about as I'm thinking about how to relate to these animals and what they're going through. But fortunately, hyenas are awesome. Okay, so I just included this example of a progression of skull development for a spotted hyena. And you can see that those zygomatic arches are getting really big and robust, and that sagittal crest is getting taller and more robust. So that shows you that this animal has a really, really big, robust jaw muscle that goes down through those zygomatic arches. And they're actually able to crush bone. So they're able to chew and digest bone, and that's why I included this picture of spotted hyena scat on the left, which it's really easy to find typically in the landscape because it's often pure white from the calcium that the hyenas are digesting. And in fact, there was a study a couple of years ago based in Ethiopia where there are some urban hyenas that feed off of livestock carcasses and landfill and that kind of thing, where they basically modeled what would happen if you took all of the spotted hyenas out of the landscape. And what they found was that disease for people and livestock would increase, and then that would have all these trickle-down effects on economics, not just public health. So these animals, through their amazing adaptations, might actually be really, really helpful for us. And that's something that I'm doing in my research program going forward as well, which I could talk about after. Coyotes are also awesome. As you know, right here in Golden Gate Park, this picture was taken, and this was on Bernal. And even in really dense areas of cities, they're probably keeping our rodent populations in check, which of course rodents can serve as disease vectors, et cetera. So they're really helping us out in a lot of ways, despite all of their people maligning these animals. Unfortunately, they also get into things, right? So they will kill people's livestock on occasion, people's pets. This is a picture in San Francisco of a cat being eaten by a coyote. Don't let your cats outdoors. I think y'all all know that here. I included this video of spotted hyenas that I took while I was studying them at one of their dens where I work in Kenya, because it shows you how curious they are. So this was one of the days where the little guys were trying to come up to my car and chew my tires, which would have created quite a predicament for me if I was just stuck in the middle of nowhere with no car. But fortunately, I was able to sort of maneuver my way out of there. So even for me, they get into my things. And the important thing also is that just one event that happens to you can impact your perceptions of that species for the rest of your life and how you view policies around their conservation and management. Even what you hear in the media can influence the way that you perceive these animals and how you support their management or conservation or lethal removal or whatever. So it's not just about what actually happens. And that leads me into my next interactive question. What are your least favorite local wildlife? Be honest. Nobody's going to see what you write. You can do it. I'm so curious. With this crowd, what's going to happen? Oh, an uncontroversial answer. Possum. All right. Someone's favorite is a possum and someone's least favorite is a possum. So don't find each other, y'all. Pigeons. Oh, this is turning into us judging each other. Rats. Yeah, I like rats, but I can see how someone wouldn't like a rat. What's we got in there? Ants. Uh-oh. Some ant experts in this building. You better steer clear of them with that opinion. Mosquitoes, I thought we would definitely get. Sea lions. That's all right. I said we weren't going to judge anybody. Okay, so the whole point of this is that obviously we get into our own issues with wildlife as well, right? So I'm pretty sure I've never met anyone who loves mosquitoes. They don't bite me in this country, so I'm fine with them, but in Kenya they do, and they really do piss me off. And there are things that they can be doing to our homes, even here in an urban space, that are very annoying to us. If we're trying to grow a garden or that kind of thing, different animals might get into our stuff. So you can even just by doing this exercise, empathize with someone who might be like, you know what, I'm going to poison all the hyenas on the landscape because I have this one cow and it's my livelihood and I'm afraid, right? These are things that we can really relate to if we think about it. And human-wildlife interactions and conflict actually do have a lot of commonalities across different geographies. They're always determined not just by the ecology and animal behavior, but by human systems, by people's values, histories, politics, and relationships. Being able to see these commonalities across different contexts has helped me, I think, to become a more holistic and empathetic researcher and conservationist. So to give you an example of kind of the richness of different factors that could go into a human-wildlife interaction, I give you Carl the coyote, right here in Golden Gate Park. This video was filmed anonymously in 2021, and it gives us a window into how the heterogeneity of human experiences can influence human-wildlife interactions and conflict. So there's one woman that really does not notice him at all. This video is a little cut off, but that's okay. Wait for her. That's got to be a really good book, right? And meanwhile, his goal in the end is actually to stalk and try to get a toddler that's going to come into the frame. at the end. So Carl, as many of you might know, showed these unusually bold predatory behaviors toward young children so many times that he was lethally removed that year by the authorities. But the story runs even deeper than that. Before this all happened, Carl was being illegally hand-fed for years by a woman suffering from homelessness in a nearby park. And this woman basically was looking for companionship, right? So when she passed away, he moved to Golden Gate Park, started exhibiting these predatory behaviors, all of which were likely heavily influenced by the systemic inequities of which that woman was a victim in the first place. And this is just a testimony. You might have been able to read it, a little bit of one of the parents that dealt with this issue with her toddler almost being attacked. And there can be so many drivers of human-wildlife interactions. Many of them are multifaceted, and they can have deep historical roots driven by human culture and politics. So, of course, ecological elements can drive human-wildlife interactions, things like vegetation availability, water availability, all of that. But also things like urban pollutants or rural pollutants or human demographics and economics and how people approach wildlife and wildlife conservation and management. Things like systemic issues like redlining and gentrification and segregation. And we'll get into some of these soon. And these negative interactions like human-wildlife conflict can be particularly concentrated in cities and in places where the landscape is rapidly developing, where humans and wildlife come into closer contact with one another, and where intentional landscape designs based in human systemic biases like racism and classism have the most intense and apparent trickle-down effects on landscape heterogeneity and human experience. As an example from our dear friend Chris Schell's paper, we can look at redlining, a policy from the 1930s to 60s in the USA, which was designed to suppress the wealth of Black neighborhoods and prioritize pouring wealth into white neighborhoods. And the effects of redlining can be seen in urban segregation today, such as with skewed urban vegetation patterns, and they also have a number of trickle-down effects which can likely extend to human and wildlife well-being and human-wildlife conflicts. So in other words, life finds a way. I love Jeff Goldblum. Life finds a way, especially for behaviorally flexible, resilient species like hyenas and coyotes. But how and what the resulting interactions with people look like can be driven by a myriad of complex factors. So that's why I'm using this intersectional and interdisciplinary lens for studying the animal movement and their interactions with people, trying to incorporate social ecological data and community engagement and empathy for all parties involved, and then use both that science and the stories around that science to foster well-being for people and wildlife. So I want to dive in a little bit to some of the work that I do. And people really like learning about how we track animals. So while I use a lot of interdisciplinary frameworks and methods, a good chunk of what I do involves GPS tracking of animals. I wanted to jump into some of those methods for those of you who haven't captured animals before. So this is a coyote collar in my hand on the left, and then some hyena collars that I removed off of hyenas last year. So how do we catch a hyena? Sorry, I didn't warn you. So there's a lot of meat coming up. So sometimes you get access to bait. I don't always have bait, but last year when I was trying to decollar my hyenas, I was gifted hundreds of pounds of rotting cow meat because a fridge at the Livestock Conservancy where I work happened to go off that week in 120-degree weather. So these are my friends helping us put the hundreds of pounds of rotting cow meat into my other friend's car, which served as the storage location for my 5 days of decollaring. There was no fridge. We live in the bush. It's 120 degrees. You can imagine how that went down. I'm a vegetarian. Well, I'm a pescatarian. I don't eat meat. So this was especially exciting for me to drive around with and live among. And just to give you more imagery, it's very dusty during the dry season. So often when I was driving from place to place in that vehicle, I would have to roll the windows up and be really in it with that rotting meat. So you can just picture that. Anyway, so then you tie it up to a tree with some, very robust wire so that you can get the hyenas to stay in place once you call them in. How do you call a hyena in? Let me tell you. So the main way that I catch hyenas, we call them in using a speaker on top of my car. And what I mean by call them in is two things. One thing is, like I mentioned, hyenas are very social. They have an intricate social structure. And as part of that, they also have a lot of different ways of communicating, including by sound. So we do use some hyena sounds that are kind of excitement sounds, which I'll get into in a second. And we also use prey sounds, prey and distress. So the sound clips that I'm going to let you hear in a moment are things that I actually do sit there listening to for hours at a time in the field. So let's start with something, chill. The buffalo calf in distress. Sorry for those of you who are sensitive. This is a little sad. Yeah, bummer. But it really brings them in. Very tasty. This next one, I really do listen to it for many hours, and I'm really sorry because it's going to be dramatic. So you prepare to close your ears if you're distressed. This is the warthog in distress. Do you sense the distress? That one is like, works every time. And then the next two are hyena sounds. So I'm going to let you hear the whoop, and you have to listen carefully because I always make people whoop with me afterward. Rachel knows. And the whoop is basically like a long distance call. So it's like, hey, I'm over here. Or usually it's also really employed when there's like a tasty food nearby, or I have a carcass, or let's go hunt, or something like that. So it's really good at bringing them in from a long distance. Aptly named. I made this one longer so you can practice in your heads before we have to do it together. Okay, are you ready? We're going to do it. 1, 2, 3. Ooh. Oh, that was really good, actually. Very good first try. We don't even have to do it. Let's do it one more time. 1, 2, 3. Ooh. Oh, excellent. Okay. So that's great. So you can call some hyenas in. They're probably on their way right now. And then the other one, which you might have heard of, the famous laugh, the giggle. So that's actually an excitement sort of sound, but it's also a nervousness sound. So like you'll often hear this giggle when there are a bunch of hyenas at a carcass and one of the higher ranking ones comes over and it's like, hey, get off my cut of meat. And the lower ranking one is like, I'm sorry. Right. So that's kind of like where you hear it in that kind of situation. So this is what it sounds like. Okay, that's very giggly. It doesn't fail to make people smile every time. So anyway, we call them in and then we dart them. This is the dart to look off. But there's a dart head here. That's my friend Kami. She's a wildlife vet in Kenya. I don't know if this is going to play, but you can just see kind of we're waiting for the hyena to go down. Oh, it is. There's a dart gun. And then we're going to go over and, take the collar off in this case and make sure she's stable, etc. So we'll just show you what she looks like. So there she is. She's kind of on her way to sleep. Okay, so coyote capture is a bit different. You don't dart them on site. You do sometimes use calls to get them into the area, but you actually use traps. So one that is really useful for catching coyotes because it's specifically for canids, and so you avoid bycatch of some other species, is called the collarum. And so it's basically you put some tasty bait onto a bite matrix, and the animal will bite on it, tug, that like very classic canid dog kind of tug, and then it throws a loop over their neck with a stopper, so it's safe. And then they're captured, and they usually just lay down and chill, unlike hyenas, which have no chill. And then you want to put some stuff around the trap to be able to get the coyotes to come into the area. So that's kind of an example of collarum bait. That's what you put on the bite matrix. You put some tasty rotting chicken or something on it. There's types of lures. Every trapper has their favorite lure, a mixture of lots of fun pheromones and meat and things like that will bring the animal to the area. If, say, you like put it on a stick that's kind of off the ground so that it can catch the wind and bring the coyotes in. And then coyote urine, which you can also use. Y'all can buy coyote urine right now. Every one of you can go purchase this on the internet. I think they even have it on Amazon. Okay, so if you ever need coyote urine for anything, it's used for a lot of things, but in this case, we will sprinkle it around the trap so that the animal will kind of sniff around and then step into the trap or notice that it's there. Sometimes you can call them in if you have a master caller like Jimmy here, Jimmy the trapper. And you can use coyote sounds or you can use prey sounds. In this case, it is a cottontail in distress. So this was actually so effective that an owl swooped down on our heads during this moment. It was a little bit frightening, actually. So then that'll bring them into the area for them to be able to sniff out the other stuff we've put around. And this is what it looks like. We're collaring coyotes last year in Irvine with Neve Quinn, who's based down in Irvine as the human wildlife interaction specialist, and that's Jimmy. Removing the muzzle, and then we let him go off into his urban landscape in a second. And we didn't use any anesthesia on this animal because he was so chill. Usually coyotes are like that. And there he goes. So that's just a sense of how we do it. And once we've got the GPS collars on, what do we do next? As a social ecological researcher, I integrate many different methods and data sources with my collar data when I'm doing a movement ecology study to get a more holistic picture of what's going on. So for instance, I do a lot of participatory work with communities. In this case, for the hyenas, we were doing, I think, about 400 community members in 16 villages surrounding the 2 protected areas where I work. Basically getting a sense of how they experience livestock predation on the landscape, how they experience risk, where they're afraid to go, but they have to go anyway, where they'd prefer to see these animals on the landscape versus where they are now, and being able to sort of elevate community voices in a way that's very interactive and puts them sort of in the teaching seat. Because as we know, maps are usually top down, right? And they're used to make a lot of decisions. And they're often very subjective too in making those decisions, right? Maps can be both scientific and artistic. So making maps from the ground up is one way that I like to do participatory work. And then I also use a lot of camera traps to basically get a more holistic view of what's going on as far as species abundance and presence and some more fine scale behaviors of the animals when I can't collar everything, right? Just as some examples. And again, harking back to that figure I showed you earlier about how we need to integrate not just ecological components, but also social and economic and other components to understand and predict and mitigate conflicts. So what does this look like? For instance, just a couple of really quick case studies. With the hyenas I study in Nakuru County, Kenya, at a baseline, the collar data can show us where they move, even at extremely fine scales, and where each clan prefers to range. So on the map on the left, with the animation, that blue hyena, that's kind of the one in the middle, is one that's in a clan that we know goes back and forth between the 2 protected areas. So if you look at the map on the right, there's a protected area on the left, protected area on the right, and you can see the green, that's the same as the blue on the left map, the green home range. This guy is doing all sorts of weird stuff. Hyenas don't typically go into each other's ranges. And we think that they're going out of the national park into the conservancy because there's so many livestock in the conservancy. And there's also a lot of refuse, like from the abattoir, where they're casting off pieces of livestock into the random parts of the conservancy. So it's all this extra food that makes it so that these animals will leave a very risk-free landscape, the national park, and go through a lot of fences to get to this conservancy where everybody hazes them and hates them. Very interesting stuff that we're still working on. But then I can loop in data from motion sense camera traps that can supplement our understanding of where hyenas move by showing us how they move. So for instance, how they're navigating these fences that are all over the place in this region, these conservation fences. So I included this video on the left I'm about to play because it used to be that there was a parallel wire fence around the national park and animals would just go underneath it. A lot of different animals. I did a whole study, a fence ecology study. I love fence ecology. But they renovated the fence and they put a wire mesh that goes a meter under the ground. And the wire mesh has these squares that are about 4 by 4 inches. So what I'm about to show you is a young hyena, probably about a year old, that has found a way to squeeze through those 4 by 4 inch, very cat-like because they are more closely related to cats than to dogs. And it's now created this age-dependent permeability of the fence. And we're hoping to do a follow-up study to see like what that really means. But the same thing with this middle video I'm about to show you. It's also prevented the adults from reaching each other. So a clan got split in half. And maybe you can see on the far side, there are a bunch of hyenas on the far side of the fence. And they do this every night. They travel along it together. We have no idea how that's affecting the clan's broader behavioral ecology. There's also one crossing point that's several miles away that they sometimes go to all the way down to and cross through. but essentially this fence has split them in half. And then this example is from before, when the fence was not renovated. Gives you a sense of how these animals are thinking and being vigilant and deciding whether to go out into this risky community landscape. And what sorts of energy are they expending in doing that? So I can't collar every hyena, but I can put cameras around to see what they're doing. But then bringing in community-sourced data on top of all of that lets us build models that show what predicts hyena movements and subsequent interactions with people. So at a landscape scale, ecological factors like vegetation and water availability, as well as human infrastructure and this human perception and tolerance that we got from the participatory mapping, as maybe a proxy for things like hazing and poisoning, those all predict where hyenas choose to move. But at finer scales, when we use something called step selection functions, basically how is a hyena choosing each step, it's actually just the human factors that are the most important in those models. So they're more influenced by how people are perceiving them and maybe acting toward them on the landscape, and then also this human infrastructure element. So looking at the way that these animals are moving at 5-minute fixed rates at different scales and incorporating these social elements is something that has made our movement models stronger than just including the ecological elements. As another example of using our community source data, our participatory data, we're able to see how people's perceptions about human-hyena conflict are different from what we're seeing with more traditional data streams like ecological and movement data. So on this map, the red areas are places where people have written in the participatory mapping sessions that they're experiencing a lot of conflict, but the government records that have been collected over many years where they go out and verify what's going on don't reflect that at all. The blue areas are hotspots where the government has put down a lot of records, gone and verified a lot of different conflicts that people are experiencing with hyenas and other carnivores. But the communities don't seem to be reflecting that in how they're perceiving conflict on the landscape. And there was like about a 20-something% difference or discrepancy among this verified and perceived conflict. And this is going to be the densest that we get, so don't worry. So diving a little bit deeper into what could be predicting that perceived conflict, that perception of risk. I used a tool called geographically weighted logistic regression to see what predicts people's perceived conflict. And on this map, I've combined participatory mapping data with some interview data that we did with the same people. And I've circled 2 regions. Yes, they are circled. Great. Where people's perceived conflict with hyenas and other carnivores are linked to those participants' beliefs that their children face threats from carnivores while they're traversing to school. So similarly, on this map, this place that I've circled here, the perceived conflict is predicted by people's beliefs that there's a shortage of wild prey in this area, which there may or may not be, right? That's not something that we've studied. But researchers and managers can use these integrated data analyses and these very site-specific, community-specific understanding of what's going on to do related research and management in these areas that we might not have thought of before. So for instance, are people in these regions facing threats from carnivores due to the fence being breached more in those areas by carnivores? Or are there ways for the management in the area, the wildlife managers, to provide some sort of transport for kids to get to school so they don't have to walk and go through these landscapes of real or perceived risk, et cetera? And we're also thinking of studying the wild prey now in this area as well, because we don't really know anything about what's going on there. Switching gears for another case study, more relevant to y'all. For coyotes, I'm actually working with data from 20 coyotes that were collared in LA. As you can see from their home ranges, they are not just in the green spaces, although some of them are. They're even in the highly urbanized areas down here, and they're really able to make it work no matter where in LA they are. And we're looking at their movements across a lot of different variables. So for example, some of the classic variables you might look to, like park access in the upper left, or vegetation greenness in the lower left, which by the way, vegetation greenness is not always correlated with the park's access in California because of our climate. Those are important to include, but it's also really important to look at things like pollution burden. So this is from CalEnviroscreen. If you haven't used it, it's an amazing resource that basically looks at pollutants and human vulnerability across California. And other sociocultural variables as well are important, like, for instance, median income. So we know that the luxury effect is something where higher wealth areas typically have had more resources poured into them, have had a lot of green spaces maintained, and that kind of thing that can influence where these animals are able to move. So I am making these pretty large social ecological models to predict coyote movement in LA. And long story short, we are seeing that the social ecological models are performing more strongly than the ecological only models. But something really interesting that we found through integrating these methods for these coyotes, for pollution burden, it turns out that coyote movement is really linked to pollution burden. So in this case, we're seeing that coyotes that live in areas with higher pollution burden have larger home ranges. So they're probably needing to go further afield to get the resources that they need. But those home ranges with higher pollution, within those, the coyotes are actually selecting for more polluted areas, which is counterintuitive, right? You'd think maybe they would take refuge in some of those less polluted areas. So we have some hypotheses about why that might be. So pollution burden might be correlated with things like municipal services access and quality. So is there more trash unsecured in these areas that coyotes are getting into? Or does that trash attract more rats that coyotes are attracted to? Or maybe the prey in those more polluted areas is weaker because of the pollutants and coyotes are taking advantage of that. These are all things that we're going to look into in the future, but this does feature really strongly in our models. In San Francisco, last but not least, I've been partnering with San Francisco Animal Care and Control, who have a long-running coyote sightings database. No need to copy this link, just look up SFACC coyote and you'll get to this form. If you see coyotes anytime, even if they're not doing anything interesting, please use it. I'm in charge of doing all the data analyses for it forever, so please help me with those. Spread it to your friends. We also have a forum for Marin and the East Bay as well, if you're interested, ask me. And we're trying to look at those trends and connect those trends to coyote movement through past collar data, and then I'll be leading the collaring efforts in San Francisco, hopefully soon, maybe next year. So this is an example from some past collar data from Presidio Trust. So, and this is coyote sightings hotspots for the past 10 years from the SFACC data. So trying to link and see whether that conflict, whether the sightings and the conflict are associated with the movement and we can actually affiliate those with one another will be something we try to do when we get more coyotes than just the Presidio ones collared. It's a lot harder than it sounds, but you can probably imagine, you know, how hard it could be to collar coyotes here logistically and also politically. We're also looking at things like how sociocultural factors like conflict, sightings, and movement map across historically redlined neighborhoods in the city. And also, perhaps more importantly, how they map across gentrification patterns, because there are a few gentrification data sets now for the city as well. And tons of other social ecological components, just to give you a bite of what's coming. But that is a lot to unpack, I know. So let's remind ourselves of why this all matters. So y'all probably heard about this lady. She was illegally hand feeding coyotes around the city, and she is not the only one. Just 2 weeks ago, I was on the coyote working group, and we were talking about how there's, you know, someone going around and being spotted feeding coyotes chicken, dog food, etc. around the city. And that trickles down into things like what we saw with Carl earlier in the presentation, where these animals will develop more boldness, etc. A fed coyote is a dead coyote. And everyone in the city has different views around how you should interact with animals. So how can we unify the ways that we're understanding animal welfare, human-wildlife interactions, and really build education around that from the ground up to be able to reach people even like her? I included this. You don't have to read it. I'll explain it. So when I was living in Oakland, like a year and a half ago, I saw this post on Nextdoor, a fantastic place, very biased, but it was still an interesting place to get some data. And this woman is basically saying, my neighbor has started feeding the coyotes down the street, and now they're following my family and I up the block, and it's terrifying. And then the next one is saying, I talked to my neighbor, John, and he thinks he's doing the right thing, and he won't stop, even though I told him why to stop. So it just shows you that in a city, you can have people with all different backgrounds, all different experiences with nature, all different ways of viewing human-wildlife interactions or feeling like they need to empathize with these animals that live right next to each other and influence each other on both small and broad scales. So urban spaces are a particularly difficult place to tackle these kinds of issues because people are coming from such different perspectives. And in line with thinking about how we relate to wildlife and how we can be intentionally harnessing narrative and storytelling to achieve broader conservation benefits, I wrote this article kind of covering P22, which I know you all know who P22 is. Who's a famous mountain lion in SoCal, who was basically the poster puma for the Wallace-Annenberg wildlife crossing, a huge wildlife crossing that's being built down in Southern California over a 10-lane highway right now, because he was all alone in the park. And he was a really interesting example because he shows us the power of narrative. People all knew who P22 was, the Hollywood cat. They followed his movements, they followed his story. And so when he started eating people's dogs, the typical response when a carnivore starts eating people's dogs is, let's get rid of that thing, go kill it. When P22 started eating people's dogs, people were like, oh, poor baby, what's wrong with him, right? And that's because people had connected with him. And now, without his story and that connection, that wildlife crossing may never have gotten the momentum that it needed in order to be built and now benefit many, many more wildlife species than just mountain lions. Also, another reason to keep thinking about these things holistically is that climate change is exacerbating human-wildlife conflict. It's bringing people and wildlife into closer proximity to one another, changing the way that resources are available on the landscape. So we have to be able to and ready to integrate different tools like animal movement analyses and camera traps, along with community engagement, and couch that in theories like One Health, the interconnectedness of people, animals, the environment, to assess the science behind how human and wildlife well-being are linked, which is what I'm doing for my Schmidt Science Fellowship, and then use that science to create stories and build policies that improve human-wildlife interactions going into the future. And just as a point of personal hope and experience, I think the biggest lesson that I've learned from all of this, and what I try to actively bring into my science and my conservation and my community, is that nearly nothing fits into these neat boxes that Western science has asked us to put things into. So I try to use a queer ecology lens to basically try and assess and find and point out the lies in those sharp lines that we're asked to draw, and how exploiting that can really help us to see things more holistically and more empathetically and make better conservation outcomes in the long term. So kind of recognizing that objectivity doesn't exist. We're taught objectivity does exist, but even how you choose to answer your questions, what questions you ask, where you get your funding, those are all things that are subjective. There's actually a great book called Objectivity, which you should all read, about that if you're like really nerdy. It's fantastic, right? And so bringing our whole selves into the science is in the conservation as well is really, really important and can be beneficial. So I've been trying to use my intersectionality and my experiences as an avenue for hope through, say, co-founding Black Mammalogists Week, which is basically creating avenues of connecting with one another as Black mammalogists and wildlife ecologists, and also creating tangible ways of boosting up young people in mammalogy. And then also thinking about queer ecology in my science communication, really valuing science communication and trying to be authentic in how I express my science, and not try to be kind of in these rigid boxes. I think that when we're as authentic as possible, we can be role models to those who are even more vulnerable than we are, both in science and beyond. It's really important and can have these kind of trickle-down effects on conservation. So I'm going to stop rambling on and just thank all of my funders and partners and labs and undergrads and wonderful people. And thank you for having me here today. And I will take your questions.
Okay, so this is not a question, but it's just a thank you, because I also wanted everyone in this room to know that Christine has been one of our very invaluable partners for the California exhibit opening next year. And a lot of the content from this talk, particularly around coyotes in San Francisco, will be in the exhibit. So thank you, Christine.
Thank you for involving me. It's like my bread and butter. I love helping out.
Thanks for that talk. That was awesome. I have a question. So you talked about those areas where the perceived conflict was higher than the actual conflict. What about those blue areas where there was more conflict than was perceived. Like, have you guys come up with some hypotheses as to why those communities or those areas like don't have as much perceived conflict?
Yeah, so a couple of things. So that those areas in the south of the national park, we tried, even though we were focused on carnivores in these participatory mapping sessions, it was really important to us to also like allow for other dialogue, just to like be able to bring that back to, because we recognize again that we're not just like these objective observers, but we have connections to the government, even though we were students at the time, and we can like bring the concerns up. So something that was coming up for those folks was that they were dealing like very recently with a lot of buffalo challenges, which buffalo are absolutely terrifying for the record. And that was like their major concern was buffalo. So in my mind, I think that that was like way overshadowing the conflict that they were having with carnivores because it was just happening so frequently for them. Which I think again gets at like this perception element. Like it's not so much like people are not experiencing conflict. It's just like the things that are top of mind and important to people should be important to managers as well and should be taken into account. So that's our main hypothesis around that.
Hi, we have one question online from, I believe it's pronounced Vuk. I'm so sorry if that's not the correct pronunciation. Vuk's wondering, are hyenas monogamous and how often do they mate?
Hyenas are not monogamous. So hyena social structure, in short, because again, there's always exceptions to the rule, queer ecology, is that usually the females are ranked more highly than all the males, because usually the high-ranking males who are natal immigrate out and join other clans and become the lowest ranking when they join a new clan. And the females have a lot of control over who they have sex with. So typically what I've seen with the hyenas in our study area is that while a female might pair up with a male, again, she has all the control, for a few days at a time, she's not going to stick with him forever. She'll mate with whoever she wants. And there's all sorts of kind of social tiffs over that. As far as how often they mate, I really don't know. It's really hard to catch them mating because, as you can imagine, when everybody has a big penis-like thing, it's really difficult to mate, right? So they try to do it kind of secretly and privately. And the only time I've ever seen it was on Camera Trap, when they just sat there for, I think, like 3 hours trying to mate with each other. And it's very awkward. So I don't know how often they mate, but now I want to look that up. Thank you.
Hey, Christine, thank you very, very much for the presentation. Great to hear. I'm curious about lessons learned from P22 and similar kinds of examples when it comes to how we think about human-wildlife conflicts in cities, especially moving forward. What are the lessons that we've learned that we could potentially reduce conflict with coyotes, for example? Are there lessons from P22?
Thank you for that question. I think that there are. So a follow-up paper that I want to collaboratively write with some people about this P22 element and this narrative and anthropomorphizing and that kind of thing is that it is helpful in some circumstances and not helpful in others, right? So like you don't necessarily want to name, I don't know, all the animals in Yellowstone because then people will go after them and start looking for them. Whereas like P22, his conservation benefits can go far, far wider than him by naming him, and people couldn't really find him anyway if they were to try. So in urban spaces, I've had a lot of conversations about what it would be like to say have like a naming contest for coyotes when we collar them, so that people can be like aware of their welfare, how they're doing, be able to keep track of them in a way that's opaque enough that maybe they get some like monthly updates or that kind of thing, that they're not able to like track them directly and bother them, but we'll be able to connect with them because quite a lot of people in the comments, the SFACC data are like, coyotes don't pay taxes and they shouldn't live here. You know, like really that's what people say. It's kind of funny. So being able to connect them with like the personality of these animals in a way that also at the same time keeps those animals safe could be a really nice way to use narrative in an urban space. And that goes beyond coyotes as well. In my opinion, I think that could really help. Yeah.
Well, oh, sorry.
You talked about the public feeding and how people think that they're doing the right thing. And I think that it was ingrained in a lot of people from like a young age to like feed animals, like feeding ducks and things. And I think that that narrative is slowly changing. But do you think that having like what suggestions do you have as far as like trying to convince these people that it's actually not better for the animals in the long run? Like maybe educational programs for like kids so that they learn this as they're getting older, or what else do you think?
Yeah, that's like foundational. Human wildlife interactions, like basics, should be taught in our schools. Like I'm a huge proponent of that. Looking at you, educator people in the room. But also like there's been one-off circumstances where I've caught someone doing something or I've heard about someone doing something and I've been able to talk with them. And what you have to remember is like that doing that kind of behavior comes from something very pure and beautiful, which is like our desire to connect with nature, right? And you can empathize with that. All of us, I think, love animals in some way or another, and we can empathize with that need to connect or desire to connect. And so I think it's really important in those one-off instances or in groups of communities where maybe they're doing that a lot, to be able to start with that empathy and be like, I know why you're doing this, and I know that you care about this animal. And because you care about this animal, let me tell you what's going to happen to it if we keep doing this, right? Or this species, and why we need to work together to make it not happen, and like make those folks into ambassadors for the communities around those issues and kind of flip it on its head. And I find that people respond to that empathy really, really well for the most part. But yeah, on a broader scale, like I really wish that people would learn about this stuff in school. I certainly didn't.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Christine, for joining us. And everyone have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.